Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the 30 Years' War, Europe's most devastating religious conflict that reshaped the continent from 1618 to 1648. We'll softly explore the complex web of religious divisions, political ambitions, and foreign interventions, from the Protestant Reformation's aftermath to the Defenestration of Prague, from the rise and fall of great military commanders to the endless diplomatic negotiations and survival intertwined across 3 decades of turmoil that would forever change the face of European civilization. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which aspect of this monumental religious conflict most intrigued you, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the 17th century lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Ferdinand, later known as Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II, stood at the precipice of European catastrophe in 1618, unaware that his fervent Catholic convictions would ignite a conflict spanning 30 years and devastate an entire continent in ways that would echo through centuries of European history. The seeds of this monumental struggle had been planted nearly a century earlier, when Martin Luther's theological rebellion fractured the unity of Western Christianity forever. By the early 17th century, Europe found itself divided not merely by faith, but by competing visions of political authority, territorial ambition, religious truth, and the very nature of legitimate governance itself. To understand the catastrophe that would engulf Europe from 1618 to 1648, we must journey back to the pivotal year of 1555, when the Peace of Augsburg attempted to heal the wounds left by decades of religious warfare. This treaty, negotiated in the shadow of Emperor Charles V's abdication, established the principle of cuius regio ius religio, whose realm, hist religion, as the foundation for religious coexistence within the Holy Roman Empire. The Augsburg settlement represented a pragmatic compromise rather than a permanent solution to Europe's religious divisions. Catholic and Lutheran princes could determine the faith of their subjects, creating a complex patchwork of religious territories across the German land. Churches, monasteries, and educational institutions changed hands according to the religious preferences of their rulers, while thousands of families found themselves forced to choose between conversion and exile. Yet this carefully constructed balance contained within it the seeds of future discord. The agreement deliberately excluded Calvinism, the Reformed faith that was gaining adherents throughout Northern Europe under the influence of John Calvin's teachings from Geneva. This exclusion created a third religious faction that challenged the delicate equilibrium established at Augsburg, as Calvinist princes found themselves without legal recognition or protection under imperial law. The Catholic Church, meanwhile, had not remained idle during these decades of Protestant expansion. The Council of Trent, concluding its momentous sessions in 1563, had launched the Counter-Reformation with renewed vigor and systematic determination. Jesuit missionaries, armed with superior education and unwavering dedication, moved through German territories like gentle soldiers of faith, establishing schools, converting nobility, and slowly but steadily winning back souls and territories to the Catholic fold. The Jesuit order, founded by Ignatius Loyola in 1540, represented the intellectual and spiritual vanguard of Catholic renewal. These black-robed scholars combined rigorous theological training with practical political acumen, making them invaluable allies to Catholic princes seeking to strengthen their religious authority. In Bavaria, Austria, and Bohemia, Jesuit colleges became centers of Catholic culture, educating the sons of nobility in languages, mathematics, philosophy, and, most importantly, unwavering loyalty to the Roman Catholic Church. As night falls gently over our understanding, we see how the Habsburg rulers, particularly in Austria and Bohemia, began implementing policies of gradual recatholicization during the late 16th century. These efforts, while carefully avoiding outright violations of the Augsburg settlement, steadily increased Catholic influence through a combination of incentives, appointment, and subtle pressure on Protestant communities. The political landscape of the Holy Roman Empire in this era resembled an intricate tapestry of competing jurisdictions and overlapping loyalty. Over 300 separate territories, ranging from mighty electorates controlling vast domains to tiny free cities governing only their immediate surroundings, maintained varying degrees of independence under the nominal authority of the Habsburg Emperor. This extraordinary fragmentation created countless opportunities for ambitious rulers to pursue their own religious and political agendas, often at the expense of imperial unity and stability. The 7 prince-electors held particular importance within this complex system. These powerful nobles, 3 ecclesiastical princes serving as archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, along with 4 secular rulers governing Bohemia, Saxony, Brandenburg, and the Palatinate, possessed the exclusive right to choose each new Holy Roman Emperor. Their votes could determine the religious and political direction of the entire empire, making their individual decisions matters of continental significance. Emperor Rudolf II, ruling from his magnificent court in Prague, embodied the contradictions and complexities of his age. A patron of the arts and sciences who surrounded himself with alchemists, astronomers, and occult philosophers, Rudolf simultaneously struggled with the practical demands of governing a diverse and fractious empire. His fascination with Renaissance humanism, Hermetic philosophy, and the pursuit of hidden knowledge created a court atmosphere that was both intellectually stimulating and politically unstable. The emperor's religious policy reflected a careful balance between Catholic conviction and political necessity. While personally devout in his Catholic faith, Rudolf understood that excessive religious zeal could provoke Protestant resistance and potentially invite. His court maintained a delicate equilibrium between Catholic orthodoxy and scholarly inquiry, allowing Protestant scholars and diplomats to participate in intellectual discussions while ensuring that Catholic ritual and doctrine remained paramount. In official ceremonies, Rudolf's personal life, however, created serious problems for imperial succession. His apparent reluctance to marry, combined with persistent rumors about his mental stability and alleged homosexual relationships, left the Habsburg dynasty without clear heirs. This uncertainty about succession would prove catastrophic when combined with the religious tensions already simmering throughout the empire. The emperor's promulgation of the Letter of Majesty in 1609, granting significant religious freedoms to Bohemian Protestants, demonstrated both his pragmatic approach to maintaining peace and his underlying weakness in the face of organized resistance. This document, extracted from Rudolf under pressure from Protestant nobles, allowed for the construction of Protestant churches, guaranteed Protestant representation in government, and established a Protestant consistory to oversee religious affairs. While this compromise temporarily prevented rebellion, it also revealed the emperor's inability to maintain Catholic authority through traditional means. Bohemia, one of the wealthiest and most strategically important territories in the Habsburg domains, had long harbored deep religious tensions rooted in its unique historical experience. The kingdom's Protestant nobility, many of whom traced their religious traditions back to the Hussite reformers of the 15th century, viewed Catholic Habsburg rule with profound suspicion and barely concealed hostility. They remembered the religious wars that had devastated their ancestors and remained constantly vigilant against any attempt to restore Catholic dominance over their ancient kingdom. The Hussite tradition in Bohemia predated Luther's Reformation by over a century, creating a distinctive religious culture that combined elements of Catholic ritual with Reformed theology and strong anti-papal sentiment. Jan Hus, the Czech priest and theologian, burned at the Council of Constance in 1415, had become a martyr figure whose memory inspired generations of Bohemian resistance to Catholic authority. The Hussite wars of the 15th century had demonstrated both the military prowess of religiously motivated Bohemian forces and the difficulty of imposing religious uniformity on a determined population. By the early 17th century, Bohemian Protestant nobles had developed sophisticated political institutions to protect their religious and civil liberties. The Bohemian estates, representing the major noble families and urban corporations, claimed ancient rights to participate in royal elections and to limit royal authority through constitutional constraints. These nobles viewed themselves as the guardians of Bohemian liberty against foreign domination, whether from Vienna, Rome, or Madrid. The University of Prague, founded by Emperor Charles IV in 1348, had become a center of Protestant learning and Czech national consciousness. Protestant professors taught theology, law, and philosophy to students from across Northern Europe, while Czech scholars developed vernacular literature and historical works that celebrated Bohemian independence and religious freedom. This intellectual ferment created an educated class of Protestant officials. His successor Matthias inherited these simmering tensions, along with the imperial crown and the complex web of competing claims within the Habsburg family. Matthias, already advanced in years and without direct heirs, faced the delicate task of managing succession planning while maintaining religious peace across his diverse domain. His adoption of his cousin, Ferdinand of Styria, as heir apparent sent shockwaves through Protestant circles, as Ferdinand's reputation for aggressive Counter-Reformation policies was well established throughout the empire. Ferdinand had indeed earned his formidable reputation through systematic and highly effective Recatholicization efforts in his own territories of Inner Austria, using a sophisticated combination of incentives for conversion, restrictions on Protestant worship, strategic appointment of Catholic officials, and the systematic use of Jesuit education. He had successfully reduced Protestant influence in regions that had been strongholds of Lutheran faith just decades earlier. His methods were legal, gradual, and remarkably effective, making him a model for Catholic princes throughout the empire and a source of terror for Protestant communities. The process of recatholicization in Ferdinand's territories involved multiple, coordinated strategies. While Protestant families found themselves gradually excluded from positions of influence and profit, Jesuit schools offered superior education to noble children, creating powerful incentives for conversion among ambitious families. Protestant churches faced increasing restrictions and regulations, while Catholic institutions received generous funding and support. Ferdinand's personal religiosity was genuine and profound, shaped by his Jesuit education and his deep conviction that Catholic truth represented the only path to salvation for his subjects. He viewed his political authority as a sacred trust that required him to guide his people toward religious truth, even when this guidance involved coercion and force. This combination of sincere religious conviction and political ruthlessness made him an extraordinarily effective advocate for Catholic restoration and an implacable enemy of Protestant resistance to Bohemian Protestant nobles. Ferdinand's succession promised nothing less than the end of their religious freedoms and political autonomy. They had witnessed his success in transforming the religious landscape of Austria and feared that similar methods would soon be applied to their own territories. The Letter of Majesty, their primary legal protection against Catholic restoration, seemed unlikely to survive Ferdinand's accession to power, particularly given his well-known views on the limits of religious tolerance. These fears were not unfounded, as events would soon demonstrate. Ferdinand's approach to religious policy combined legal precision with relentless pressure, making it difficult for opponents to organize effective resistance while gradually eroding the foundations of Protestant power. His success in Austria suggested that similar methods could transform Bohemia within a generation, reducing Protestant nobles to a powerless minority in their own kingdom. The growing tension between Catholic restoration and Protestant resistance was exacerbated by broader European political development. The 12 years' truce between Spain and the Dutch Republic was scheduled to expire in 1621, raising the prospect of renewed warfare in the Low Countries. Spanish strategic planning required secure communications between Spanish territories in Italy and the Spanish Netherlands, communications that depended on maintaining control over the Rhine Valley and preventing hostile powers from disrupting Spanish supply lines. The Palatinate, ruled by the Protestant elector Frederick V. Frederick's conversion to Calvinism and his leadership of the Protestant Union made him a natural enemy of Spanish interests, potentially brought English power into opposition to Spanish plans. Spanish policymakers viewed the coming expiration of the truce as an opportunity to resolve these strategic problems permanently through military action. French policy during this period remained carefully balanced between opposition to Habsburg power and reluctance to support Protestant causes directly. King Louis XIII, still young and heavily influenced by his mother, Marie de' Medici, and various court factions, had not yet developed the clear anti-Habsburg strategy that would later characterize French foreign policy under Cardinal Richelieu. French nobles, many of whom had Calvinist sympathy, pressed for more active support of Protestant causes, while Catholic advisors warned against allying with heretics against fellow Catholics. The complex web of dynastic marriages and territorial claims that connected European ruling families added additional layers of complexity to these religious and political tensions. Every succession crisis, every disputed inheritance, every marriage negotiation carried potential implications for The religious balance of power. Spanish influence in Vienna, English connections to the Palatinate, French interests in Germany, and Dutch concerns about Spanish power all intersected in ways that made local conflict potential triggers for continental warfare as tensions mounted. Throughout the empire, during the 1610s, the Protestant Union, established in 1608 under the leadership of Frederick IV of the Palatinate, represented an attempt to coordinate Protestant resistance to Catholic restoration. This alliance included major Protestant territories such as Brandenburg, Württemberg, and various imperial cities, creating a potential military force capable of challenging Catholic armies. The Catholic League, formed in response to the Protestant Union under the leadership of Duke Maximilian of Bavaria, provided a corresponding organization for Catholic defense. Maximilian, a devout Catholic and skilled military organizer, had transformed Bavaria into the strongest Catholic territory in the empire outside of Habsburg land. His alliance with ecclesiastical princes and smaller Catholic territories created a formidable coalition that could match Protestant religious disputes into potential flashpoints for empire-wide conflict. The Cologne War of 1583 to 1588, triggered by the conversion of the Archbishop Elector to Protestantism, had demonstrated how quickly religious disputes could escalate into military confrontations, involving multiple territories and foreign powers. The Jülich-Cleves succession crisis of 1609 to 1614 had shown how disputed inheritances could bring France, Spain, and various German princes to the brink of warfare. The formation of these religious alliances coincided with significant military innovations that would profoundly influence the coming conflict. The Dutch revolt against Spanish rule had produced tactical and organizational innovations that revolutionized European warfare. Maurice of Nassau had developed new infantry formations that maximized the effectiveness of firearms while reducing vulnerability to cavalry charges. These linear formations, combined with improved artillery and more systematic military engineering, created armies capable of unprecedented destructive power. Military entrepreneurs like Albrecht von Wallenstein began developing new approaches to army financing and logistics that would make large-scale, long-duration campaigns economically feasible. Instead of relying on traditional feudal levies or expensive mercenary contracts, this innovation would prove crucial during the extended campaigns of the 30 Years' War. The growth of military professionalism during this period also contributed to the changing nature of warfare. Professional officers, trained in mathematics, engineering, and classical military theory, began replacing traditional noble commanders, whose qualifications rested primarily on birth and personal courage. Military academies, first established in the late 16th century, produced officers capable of conducting complex siege operations, managing large supply systems, and coordinating multi-unit battlefield tactics. These military developments occurred alongside significant changes in European economic and social structures. The growth of international trade, the influx of precious metals from the Americas, and the development of more sophisticated financial instruments created new sources of wealth that could support expanded military expenditures. Banking houses in Augsburg, Amsterdam, and Genoa developed methods for financing military campaigns across international boundaries, making it possible for relatively small territories to maintain large armies for extended periods. The social Changes accompanying these economic developments included the growth of educated middle classes in German cities, and the gradual erosion of traditional feudal relationships between lords and subjects. These changes created new sources of social tension that intersected with religious conflicts in complex ways. Urban Protestant communities often supported religious reform as part of broader resistance to traditional authority, while Catholic restoration frequently involved efforts to strengthen traditional hierarchies and resist social change. The cultural and intellectual atmosphere of early 17th century Europe reflected these underlying tensions and uncertainties. The Renaissance celebration of human potential and classical literature, art, and music began exploring themes of uncertainty, mortality, and the fragility of human institutions. The popularity of Hermetic philosophy, astrology, and other occult studies reflected widespread searching for hidden meanings and secret knowledge that might provide guidance in an increasingly complex and dangerous world. Scientific development during this period, including the astronomical observations of Tycho Brahe knowledge. These intellectual ferments contributed to the religious and political uncertainties that would soon explode in Prague, where Protestant Bohemian nobles confronted Ferdinand's representatives over disputed religious appointments and property rights. The confrontation escalated when the nobles, led by Count Thurn, seized the royal governors Vilém Slavata and Jaroslav Berzit, along with their secretary Philip Fabricius, and threw them from a castle window in what became known as the Third Defenestration of Prague. This dramatic event, which combined political rebellion with a touch of dark comedy, sent shockwaves throughout the Habsburg domains and beyond. While Catholic accounts attributed their survival to divine intervention by angels who cushioned their fall, regardless of the precise landing conditions, this act of rebellion constituted a fundamental challenge to monarchy. The Defenestration represented far more than mere religious protest or aristocratic resistance to royal policy. By physically ejecting Ferdinand's representatives and subsequently deposing him as King of Bohemia, the Protestant estates were declaring their right to choose their own ruler based on religious and political preferences, rather than dynastic inheritance. This challenge to the principle of hereditary monarchy struck at the foundations of early modern political order, and threatened to inspire similar rebellions throughout Europe. The Bohemian rebels moved quickly to consolidate their position and seek international support for their cause. They established a provisional government dominated by Protestant nobles and opened negotiations with potential allies throughout Protestant Europe. Count Thurn emerged as the military leader of the rebellion. Union transformed a local rebellion into a European crisis. Acceptance of the Bohemian crown would mean war with the most powerful Catholic dynasty in Europe, while refusal would abandon fellow Protestants to certain Habsburg. His marriage to Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of King James I of England, leader of the Protestant Union, created expectations that he would support fellow Protestants in their struggle against Catholic oppression, but also made him a natural target for Catholic retaliation. The decision was further complicated by conflicting advice from counselors, allies, and family members. Some advisors urged Frederick to accept the crown as a religious duty and a strategic opportunity to strengthen Protestant power in Central Europe. Others warned that the military resources of the Protestant Union were insufficient to defeat the combined might of the Habsburg monarchy and the Catholic League. His father-in-law, James I, strongly advised against acceptance, fearing that English involvement in a German religious war would bankrupt his kingdom and destroy his carefully maintained neutrality. Despite these warnings and the obvious dangers involved, Frederick ultimately accepted the Bohemian crown in 1619. His coronation in Prague marked the beginning of what Catholics would call a rebellion, and Protestants would hail as a liberation struggle. The new king's court attracted Protestant intellectuals, military advisors, and political theorists from across Europe, creating a brief flowering of Reformed culture in the ancient Bohemian capital. Frederick's reign, however, proved as brief as a winter's day, earning him the mocking title of the Winter King. Experience extended back to the Dutch wars. Spanish forces simultaneously moved to secure the strategic Palatinate of the Counter-Reformation's institutional development and the superior resources available to Habsburg forces. Maximilian of Bavaria had spent decades building a professional military establishment that could rapidly mobilize trained troops and modern equipment. The Catholic League's financial resources, supplemented by Spanish subsidies and church wealth, provided the funding necessary for extended military campaign. Within a year of Frederick's coronation, the Protestant cause in Bohemia faced military disaster. The Battle of White Mountain, fought on November 8th, a century, methodically destroyed the hastily assembled Bohemian army. Protestant resistance collapsed completely, sending Frederick fleeing toward the Dutch border and leaving his supporters to face Habsburg retribution. The speed and completeness of the Catholic victory at White Mountain shocked Protestant observers throughout Europe and demonstrated the military superiority that systematic preparation and professional leadership could provide. They had crushed a rebellion, destroyed an alternative political system, society that would endure for centuries and fundamentally alter the character of Central European civilization. The public execution of 27 Protestant leaders in Prague's Old Town Square on June 21, 1621, demonstrated the emperor's determination to crush resistance permanently and serve as a warning to potential rebels throughout his domain. These executions were carefully orchestrated as both political theater and religious ritual. The condemned men, representing the cream of Bohemian Protestant nobility and urban leadership, were allowed to make final speeches and undergo religious ministrations before their deaths. Some converted to Catholicism in their final hours, providing propaganda victories for Catholic observers, while others maintained their Protestant faith to the end, becoming martyrs for the Protestant cause. The mass confiscation of Protestant estates that followed provided both rewards for Catholic supporters and funding for further military campaigns. Approximately half of all noble landholdings in Bohemia changed hands during the 1620s, creating a new Catholic aristocracy loyal to Habsburg rule while devastating the economic foundations of Protestant resistance. These confiscations were conducted according to legal procedures that gave them a veneer of legitimacy, while accomplishing the political goal of eliminating Protestant power permanently. The Counter-Reformation now proceeded with unprecedented intensity and systematic thoroughness throughout the Habsburg domain. Jesuit missions established new schools and churches in every significant town, while Protestant institutions were systematically closed or converted to Catholic use. The University of Prague, once a center of reformist thought and Czech national consciousness, became a Jesuit institution dedicated to Catholic orthodoxy and Habsburg loyalty. thousands of Protestant families faced the stark choice between conversion and exile, leading to a massive population transfer that drained Bohemia of much of its educated and entrepreneurial class. Entire communities of skilled craftsmen, merchants, and professionals departed for Protestant territories in Germany, the Netherlands, and England, taking with them not only their personal wealth but also their knowledge, skills, and cultural traditions. This religious transformation extended beyond mere matters of faith to encompass language, culture, and national identity. Czech Protestant traditions, closely linked to the Hussite heritage and embodied in vernacular literature and religious practices, gave way to Austrian Catholic culture imposed from Vienna. The Czech language itself faced systematic suppression in official and educational contexts, as German became the language of administration, higher education, and social advancement. The transformation of Bohemia served as a model for Counter-Reformation efforts throughout Catholic Europe and demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated religious, political, and cultural policies in achieving lasting change. Ferdinand II's success in Bohemia would influence Catholic strategies for decades to come and provide inspiration for similar efforts in other contested territory. The international implications of the Bohemian settlement extended far beyond the immediate military and religious consequences. What had begun as a local rebellion gradually evolved into a European war as various powers recognized the strategic implications of Habsburg victory and the potential for further Catholic advances. The Spanish government, led by the capable Duke of Olivares, viewed the conflict as an opportunity to crush Dutch independence permanently and restore Catholic unity throughout Northern Europe. Spanish strategic thinking was dominated by the concept of maintaining secure communications between Spanish territories in Italy and the Spanish Netherlands. The Spanish Road, the overland route that connected these vital possessions, ran through territories that were now potentially hostile following the Protestant rebellion. Spanish control of the Palatinate and other Rhine territories became essential for maintaining the flow of troops, supplies, and silver that sustained Spanish power in Northern Europe. French reactions to Habsburg's success in Bohemia reflected the complex intersection of religious conviction and political calculation that characterized European diplomacy during this period. While France remained officially Catholic, and many French nobles had personal sympathy for the Catholic cause, French strategic interests demanded opposition to further Habsburg expansion. The encirclement of France by Spanish and Austrian territories created security concerns that transcended religious loyalty. Cardinal Richelieu, who emerged as the dominant figure in French policy during the 1620s, represented a new type of political leader whose decisions were guided primarily by reasons of state rather than religious conviction. His willingness to support Protestant powers against Catholic enemies marked a fundamental shift in European diplomatic culture and contributed to the gradual separation of religious and political considerations in international relations. The German princes found themselves torn between religious sympathy and political calculation as the conflict expanded beyond its original Bohemian boundaries. Many Lutheran rulers had initially tolerated Ferdinand's reconquest of Bohemia, reasoning that rebellion against legitimate authority set dangerous precedents that could eventually threaten their own positions. However, Ferdinand's subsequent policies, particularly the Edict of Restitution in 1629, convinced them that Habsburg ambitions threatened all Protestant territories and required coordinated resistance. The Edict of Restitution, promulgated by Ferdinand at the height of his military success, demanded the return of all church lands secularized since 1555, potentially affecting hundreds of territories throughout the empire. While legally defensible under Catholic interpretation of imperial law, the edict threatened to destabilize the entire German political structure by altering the territorial balance that had existed for over 70 years. Protestant princes viewed the edict as proof that Ferdinand intended to reverse the Reformation entirely and restore Catholic dominance throughout Germany. The fact that implementation would require extensive use of imperial military force made it clear that Ferdinand was no longer content to serve as an impartial arbitrator between competing religious factions, but had become an active partisan. In the Catholic cause, the edict's announcement coincided with imperial military successes that seemed to make its implementation feasible. Albrecht von Wallenstein, Ferdinand's brilliant military entrepreneur, had created an army capable of projecting imperial power throughout Germany and beyond. His forces controlled vast territories in northern Germany and seemed poised to establish Habsburg hegemony over the entire empire. Christian IV of Denmark entered the conflict in 1625, motivated by a complex mixture of religious solidarity, political ambition, and economic interest that reflected the multifaceted nature of the emerging European crisis. As Duke of Holstein, Christian held territories within the Holy Roman Empire, giving him legal standing to intervene in German affairs as a concerned prince defending imperial liberties against imperial tyranny. Christian's control of Baltic trade routes also provided both the resources and motivation to prevent Habsburg domination of northern Germany. Danish prosperity depended on maintaining access to German markets and preventing any single power from controlling the river systems that connected the Baltic to the German interior. Imperial success in northern Germany threatened to make Denmark a satellite of Habsburg power rather than an independent force in Baltic affairs. The Danish intervention initially seemed promising for the Protestant cause and appeared to offer hope for reversing Catholic gains throughout northern Germany. Christian commanded experienced troops, hardened by service in previous conflicts, possessed substantial financial resources derived from Danish commercial activities, and enjoyed potential support from other Protestant powers. French subsidies supplemented his war chest, while English encouragement provided additional diplomatic backing. The Lower Saxon circle's election of Christian as their military commander gave his intervention a legal foundation within imperial constitutional structures, allowing Protestant propagandists to portray the conflict as a legitimate defense of German liberties rather than foreign aggression. This constitutional justification would prove important for maintaining German Protestant support throughout the subsequent military campaigns. However, Ferdinand II had learned valuable lessons from his earlier struggles and had entrusted military command to Albrecht von Wallenstein, whose tactical genius and organizational innovations would prove decisive in the coming campaigns. Wallenstein represented a new type of military leader whose success depended on professional competence rather than noble birth or traditional authority. Wallenstein's innovative approach to military logistics, essentially making war pay for itself through systematic exploitation of occupied territories, provided the emperor with a formidable instrument of policy that could operate independently of traditional financial constraints. His system of contributions and military taxation created self-sustaining armies that could campaign indefinitely in foreign territories without draining imperial resources. The Danish forces met disaster at the Battle of Lutter in 1626, where Wallenstein's disciplined troops demonstrated the superiority of professional military organization over traditional feudal levies. The victory opened northern Germany to imperial conquest and established Wallenstein's reputation as one of Europe's most dangerous military commanders. Wallenstein's success at Lutter was followed by a systematic conquest of northern German territories that brought imperial forces to the Baltic coast for the first time in centuries. The siege of Stralsund in 1628 marked the high tide of Habsburg power and seemed to herald the establishment of imperial naval power that could challenge Danish and Swedish control of Baltic trade. The prospect of Habsburg naval power in the Baltic fundamentally altered the strategic calculations of northern European powers and made continued Danish resistance increasingly difficult. Swedish concern about imperial expansion toward the Baltic would soon draw another major power into the German conflicts, ensuring that local religious disputes would evolve into continental warfare. Wallenstein's emergence as one of the most fascinating and controversial figures of the entire conflict reflected the changing nature of European politics and warfare during this transformative period. Born into minor Bohemian nobility, he had accumulated vast wealth through strategic marriages, skillful exploitation of wartime opportunities, and careful investment in confiscated Protestant estates. His ability to raise, supply, and command large armies made him indispensable to Ferdinand II. But his growing power and ambiguous loyalties ultimately made him dangerous to the very emperor he served. Wallenstein's success demonstrated both the opportunities available to talented individuals during periods of upheaval and the potential threats that such individuals could pose to traditional authority. Wallenstein's military innovations extended beyond tactics to encompass logistics, finance, and administration in ways that would influence military development for generations. His armies lived off contributions imposed on occupied territories according to systematic schedules that balanced exploitation with economic survival. This approach created self-sustaining military organizations that could operate far from their bases for extended periods while maintaining discipline and effectiveness. The system of military contributions developed by Wallenstein involved more than simple plunder or random taxation. His administrators established regular contribution schedules based on careful assessment of local resources, ensuring that occupied territories could continue functioning while supporting military operations. This systematic approach to war finance would be copied by other military entrepreneurs and eventually adopted by national armies throughout Europe. Wallenstein's personal accumulation of wealth and territories created a power base that eventually rivaled that of traditional princes and made him a political figure in his own right. His purchases of confiscated Bohemian estates, combined with imperial grants and military profits, made him one of the wealthiest individuals in Central Europe and gave him resources that could support independent political action. The Duchy of Mecklenburg, granted to Wallenstein by Ferdinand II in 1627, provided him with a sovereign title and territorial base that alarmed other German princes, regardless of their religious affiliations. The precedent of deposing legitimate princes and transferring their territories to military entrepreneurs threatened the security of all established rulers and contributed to growing opposition to imperial policies. Yet, Wallenstein's success also bred resentment among traditional Habsburg allies who viewed his rapid rise as a threat to their own positions and privileges. The Catholic League princes, led by Maximilian of Bavaria, increasingly viewed his armies as competitors rather than allies and feared that his personal ambitions might conflict with broader Catholic interests. Spanish advisors at the imperial court worried that Wallenstein's independent power base might ultimately serve his personal interests rather than Habsburg dynastic goals. His negotiations with Protestant powers, whether for tactical advantage or potential treachery, created suspicions about his ultimate loyalty that would eventually prove fatal. Even Emperor Ferdinand grew concerned about his generals' accumulation of wealth and territories, particularly as Wallenstein's success made him less dependent on imperial favor and more capable of independent action. The delicate balance between imperial authority and military effectiveness became increasingly difficult to maintain as Wallenstein's power continued to grow. The Edict of Restitution, promulgated by Ferdinand in 1629 at the height of his military success, represented both the high water mark of Catholic restoration and a fundamental miscalculation that would ultimately undermine Habsburg achievements. This decree demanded the return of all church lands secularized since 1555, potentially affecting hundreds of territories throughout the empire and altering the religious balance that had existed for over 70 years. While the edict was legally defensible under Catholic interpretation of imperial law and the Peace of Augsburg, its implementation would have required a complete reorganization of German territorial arrangements. Bishoprics, monasteries, and other church properties that had been incorporated into Protestant territories for generations would have to be restored to Catholic control, displacing thousands of families and destroying established political arrangements. The scope of potential changes under the edict was staggering in its implications for German society and politics. Major Protestant territories would lose significant portions of their territory and revenue, while Catholic institutions would regain vast wealth and influence that had been lost during the early decades of the Reformation. The university towns, trading centers, and administrative networks that had developed around secularized church properties would face complete disruption. Protestant princes viewed the edict as proof that Ferdinand intended to reverse the Reformation entirely and establish Catholic hegemony throughout Germany. The fact that implementation would depend on imperial military force made it clear that the emperor was no longer content to serve as an impartial arbitrator between competing religious factions, but had become an active partisan pursuing Catholic victory. The announcement of the edict coincided with imperial military dominance that seemed to make implementation feasible regardless of Protestant resistance. Wallenstein's armies controlled vast territories throughout northern and central Germany, while Catholic League forces maintained pressure on remaining Protestant strongholds. The combination of military success and legal justification appeared to provide Ferdinand with the tools necessary for comprehensive religious restoration. However, the edict's announcement also created new incentives for foreign intervention. In German affairs, powers that had previously remained neutral or limited their involvement to diplomatic protests now faced the prospect of permanent Catholic dominance on their borders. Swedish concern about imperial expansion toward the Baltic combined with French fears of Habsburg encirclement to create a powerful coalition dedicated to preventing Ferdinand's success. Wallenstein's dismissal in 1630 reflected Ferdinand's attempt to appease critics while consolidating Catholic gains. But this decision proved premature, as new threats soon emerged that would require the general's unique talents once again. The emperor's calculation that Wallenstein's unpopularity with traditional allies outweighed his military value would prove costly as Protestant resistance reorganized under new leadership. King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden transformed the character of the conflict when he landed in Pomerania in 1630 with 18,000 veteran troops, bringing revolutionary military innovations that would influence European warfare for generations. Unlike previous interventions, motivated primarily by religious solidarity or defensive concerns, Swedish involvement represented a calculated attempt to establish Baltic dominance and challenge Habsburg hegemony throughout Northern Europe. Gustavus Adolphus had spent years preparing for this intervention, studying the lessons of earlier Protestant failures and developing military/innovations that addressed the tactical and organizational weaknesses that had doomed previous campaigns. His reforms encompassed every aspect of military organization, from recruitment and training to tactics and logistics, creating an army that represented the cutting edge of early modern military science. The Swedish military system emphasized mobility, firepower, and discipline in ways that departed radically from traditional European practice. Where other armies relied on massive infantry squares that moved slowly and required extensive logistical support, Swedish forces operated in linear formations that maximized their superior musketry while maintaining tactical flexibility. These innovations allowed smaller Swedish forces to defeat larger traditional armies through superior coordination and devastating firepower. Swedish tactical reforms also extended to artillery, where Gustavus Adolphus introduced lighter cannon that could move with advancing infantry and provide direct fire support during battles. These regimental guns gave Swedish forces unprecedented tactical flexibility and allowed them to maintain offensive momentum that traditional armies could not match. The integration of artillery, infantry, and cavalry into coordinated tactical systems represented a revolution in military thinking that would influence warfare well into the 18th century. The moral dimension of Swedish intervention proved equally important in rallying Protestant support throughout Germany and Northern Europe. Gustavus Adolphus cultivated his image as the defender of Protestant Christianity against Catholic aggression, presenting himself as a latter-day champion of biblical truth against papal tyranny. His personal charisma and genuine religious conviction made him an inspirational figure for Protestant soldiers and civilians throughout the conflict zone. Swedish troops operated under strict codes of conduct that contrasted sharply with the rapacious behavior typical of mercenary armies during this period. Systematic punishment of rape, unauthorized plunder, and violence against civilians earned widespread civilian support and made Swedish occupation preferable to that of most other armies. This disciplinary advantage provided crucial intelligence, logistical support, and recruitment opportunities that contributed significantly to Swedish military success. The king's personal leadership style combined scholarly preparation with battlefield courage in ways that inspired both professional soldiers and common troops. Gustavus Adolphus had studied classical military texts, consulted with experienced commanders, and personally tested new weapons and tactics before implementing them in actual campaigns. His willingness to share battlefield dangers with his soldiers while maintaining strict discipline created a military culture that balanced professionalism with personal loyalty. Swedish preparations for German intervention included extensive diplomatic efforts to secure financial support and coordinate strategy with other Protestant powers. French subsidies, negotiated by Cardinal Richelieu as part of his anti-Habsburg strategy, provided crucial funding that allowed Sweden to maintain its forces throughout extended campaigns. These payments represented one of the earliest examples of systematic foreign subsidy programs that would become standard features of early modern warfare. The Battle of Breitenfeld, fought on September 17, 1631, demonstrated Swedish military superiority decisively and marked a turning point in the entire conflict. Count Tilly's traditional Catholic League forces, arranged in the massive squares that had dominated European battlefields for over a century, proved helpless against Swedish tactical innovations and superior coordination. The battle began with Saxon forces under Elector John George fleeing the field after minimal resistance, leaving Swedish troops to face the entire Catholic army alone. However, Gustavus Adolphus had anticipated this possibility and had positioned his forces to operate independently while maintaining communications and coordination between separated units. Swedish artillery, lighter and more mobile than traditional siege guns, moved with advancing infantry to provide continuous fire support throughout the engagement. Infantry formations, arranged in 6 ranks rather than the traditional 10 or 12, delivered devastating musket volleys while maintaining the mobility necessary for tactical maneuvering. Cavalry units, trained to charge with sabers rather than relying on pistol fire, broke through Catholic formations that had been disrupted by artillery and musket fire. The victory at Breitenfeld opened central Germany to Swedish advance and restored Protestant morale throughout the empire. News of the battle traveled rapidly through Protestant communities, inspiring new resistance efforts and encouraging previously neutral territories to reconsider their allegiances. The demonstration that Catholic forces could be defeated through superior tactics and leadership transformed also had profound implications for military development throughout Europe. Professional soldiers and military theorists studied Swedish tactics extensively, leading to widespread adoption of linear formations, lighter artillery, and integrated tactical systems. The battle marked the beginning of fundamental changes in European warfare that would influence military development for generations. Tilly's death at the Battle of Rain in April 1632 removed one of the most experienced Catholic commanders and forced Ferdinand II to recall Wallenstein despite the political risks involved. The emperor's recognition that only Wallenstein possessed the skills and resources necessary to counter Swedish advances demonstrated the crucial importance of military leadership during this period of rapid tactical innovation. Wallenstein's return to imperial service marked the beginning of the war's most dramatic and personal phase, as 2 of Europe's most brilliant military commanders prepared for direct confrontation. Both Gustavus Adolphus and Wallenstein understood that their coming engagement would likely determine the future of Central Europe and the ultimate outcome of the religious and political struggles that had convulsed Germany for over a decade. The psychological dimensions of this confrontation extended beyond mere military competition to encompass competing visions of European political and religious development. Gustavus Adolphus represented Protestant hopes for religious freedom and political decentralization, while Wallenstein embodied Catholic aspirations for religious unity and imperial authority. Their personal conflict symbolized the broader civilizational struggle that had engulfed Europe since the early days of the Reformation. Wallenstein's strategic response to Swedish advances demonstrated his understanding of both Swedish tactical advantages and their underlying weaknesses. Rather than meeting Swedish forces in open battle, where their tactical superiority would prove decisive, he established fortified positions that forced the Swedes to attack prepared defenses or abandon their offensive momentum. The confrontation at Altovest in late August 1632 represented Wallenstein's strategic masterpiece and Gustavus Adolphus's greatest tactical blunder. Wallenstein positioned his forces in a heavily fortified camp that neutralized Swedish advantages in mobility and artillery, while forcing them to attack uphill against prepared positions. Gustavus Adolphus, perhaps overconfident after his earlier victories, ordered a direct assault on the imperial camp that resulted in bloody repulse and heavy Swedish casualties. The failure demonstrated that even the most innovative tactical systems could not overcome fundamental strategic disadvantages when employed inappropriately. The Battle of Lutzen, fought on November 16, 1632, became one of the most significant and tragic engagements of the entire conflict. Both armies deployed approximately 20,000 men in fighting that would determine the immediate future of Protestant resistance and Catholic restoration throughout Central Europe. The battle began in thick morning mist that prevented effective artillery use and reduced visibility to a few dozen yards. These conditions negated many Swedish tactical advantages while creating confusion that made coordinated operations extremely difficult for both sides. Individual units fought desperate engagements without clear understanding of the broader tactical situation. Gustavus Adolphus, leading a cavalry charge in the swirling mists of the Saxon battlefield, fell to enemy fire at the moment when Swedish forces were achieving victory. His death deprived the Protestant cause of its most charismatic leader and most skilled commander, while transforming the nature of Swedish participation in the German conflict. The king's death was kept secret for several hours, while Swedish commanders attempted to maintain battlefield coordination and prevent panic among their troops. When news of the loss finally spread, Swedish soldiers fought with desperate fury that drove Wallenstein's forces from the field, despite their own heavy casualties. Wallenstein's retreat from Lutzen, abandoning his artillery and wounded, allowed Swedish propagandists to claim victory despite their devastating loss. However, the practical result was the effective end of Swedish offensive capability and the beginning of a more defensive phase in Protestant strategy. Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna, assuming leadership of Swedish policy after the king's death, faced the enormous challenge of maintaining Swedish influence in Germany without the personal leadership and military genius that had made earlier successes possible. His formation of the Heilbronn League in 1633 represented an attempt to organize German Protestant resistance under Swedish leadership. while adapting to new strategic reality. The Heilbronn League brought together surviving Protestant territories under Swedish protection and coordination, creating a political structure that could theoretically continue resistance even without direct Swedish military dominance. However, the League's effectiveness depended on maintaining Swedish military credibility and financial resources that were increasingly strained by the costs of extended warfare. Wallenstein's own demise came in February 1634 in circumstances that revealed the paranoid atmosphere surrounding imperial politics and the dangers faced by military commanders who accumulated too much independent power. Suspected of treasonous negotiations with enemy powers and possible plans for independent action, the great general was assassinated by his own officers in the Bohemian town of Eger. The conspiracy against Wallenstein involved both imperial court figures who feared his growing independence and military subordinates who hoped to gain favor through eliminating a potentially treacherous commander. The assassination was carefully planned and quickly executed, or revealing the true extent of his negotiations with various parties. Wallenstein's death removed the last of the war's great military innovators while demonstrating that even the most successful commanders remained vulnerable to political intrigue and court. Swedish forces were reorganizing under new leadership. The immediate aftermath of Wallenstein's assassination saw imperial forces struggling to maintain coherence and offensive capability without their most experienced commander. His death created opportunities for Protestant recovery that might not otherwise have existed, while also removing a figure whose ambitions had created increasing tensions within the Catholic coalition. Ferdinand II's reliance on Spanish military, a fundamental shift in the conflict's dynamics, and demonstrated the emperor's weakened position within his own domains. Spanish priorities focused primarily on maintaining secure communications between Italy and the Netherlands, did not always align with imperial interests in Germany. The Battle of Entredlingen, fought on September 6, 1634, represented the coordinated Spanish imperial response to Swedish Cardinal Infante Ferdinand of Austria, combined with imperial forces under King forces. The victory at Entredlingen destroyed Swedish military power in southern Germany and led to the defection of most German Protestant allies, who now sought accommodation with the emperor rather than continued resistance. The battle demonstrated that Swedish tactical innovations could be countered through superior numbers. The possibility for a general German peace that would end the religious conflicts while preserving Habsburg authority throughout most of the empire. The Peace of Prague, signed in 1635, represented Ferdinand II's attempt to consolidate his gains, while removing the foreign interventions that had prolonged and internationalized the German conflicts. The Peace of Prague revoked the controversial Edict of Restitution while confirming most Catholic gains achieved through military conquest and voluntary conversion. This compromise allowed Protestant princes to retain their current territories while abandoning claims to further restoration of secularized church properties. The settlement also provided for the dissolution of the Protestant Union and Catholic League, replacing them with a unified imperial army under Habsburg command, transformed what might have been a concluding German settlement into the opening phase of a broader European struggle for hegemony, interests over religious loyalty, and marked the beginning of a new phase in European religious struggle to a dynastic and territorial competition between the Bourbon and Habsburg houses. Religious motivations, while still present among some participants, beginning in 1635, would continue until 1659. Battles in Flanders, Italy, Catalonia. Strategic objectives included weakening Habsburg power permanently, acquiring territories along France's eastern frontier, and establishing French influence in Germany as a counterweight to Austrian and Spanish dominance. These goals required sustained military commitment and financial international balance of power. As the conflict entered its third decade, the nature of warfare itself began to deteriorate in ways that shocked even contemporaries accustomed to military violence, whose primary motivation was survival and plunder rather than military or political objectives that transcended immediate material needs. The breakdown of central authority and systematic military organization meant that armies often operated independently of their supposed commanders. These military formations resembled mobile cities more than traditional armies of the German countryside, reflected this degradation of military purpose and the collapse of traditional restraints on military behavior. The famous phrase, "war feeds war," captured the self-perpetuating nature of a conflict that had lost clear political direction while generating its own economic and social dynamics. Contemporary accounts describe a landscape transformed by constant warfare in ways that fundamentally altered the relationship between human society and the natural environment. Vast areas of Germany were depopulated through death. Centuries of local government that had maintained public order for generations. Communities that had survived for centuries disappeared within a few years, leaving only ruins and memories to mark their former existence. Medical care, already primitive by modern standards, became virtually non-existent for civilian populations. Caught in the path of military operations, bubonic plague, typhus, dysentery, and other diseases killed far more people than battle wounds, creating a demographic disaster that affected entire regions. The psychological impact of prolonged warfare on surviving populations manifested in various forms of social pathology and religious extremism. Witch trials multiplied as communities sought supernatural explanations for their sufferings and scapegoats for their misfortunes. Culture during this period reflected the general atmosphere of uncertainty, violence, and spiritual crisis that pervaded European society. Literature, art, and music began exploring themes of mortality, uncertainty, humanism of the Renaissance era. The economic disruption caused by 3 decades of warfare extended far beyond the immediate zones of military operations to affect trade, manufacturing, and agriculture throughout Central Europe. Traditional commercial networks were disrupted or destroyed, while others rose to new prominence based on their ability to adapt to wartime conditions. The Hanseatic League, that ancient confederation of trading cities that had dominated Baltic commerce for centuries, never recovered from the disruption of its traditional routes and market. Amsterdam, by contrast, consolidated its position as Northern Europe's premier commercial hub by adapting quickly to new trading opportunities created by the conflict. Agricultural recovery proceeded slowly and unevenly across the devastated territories, with some regions requiring decades to restore pre-war population levels, while others never fully recovered their former prosperity. The demographic impact of the war influenced marriage patterns, inheritance customs, and social structures throughout Central Europe in ways that persisted long after the fighting ended. The development of more sophisticated military logistics and administration during the war years contributed to the growth of state bureaucracies and professional military establishments that would characterize European governance for centuries. The challenges of maintaining large armies over extended periods forced governments to develop new methods of taxation, recruitment, and supply that expanded state power while creating new forms of military professionalism. By the 1640s, exhaustion had replaced enthusiasm among all participants in the conflict, as military victories no longer translated into lasting political gains, while the resources needed to exploit success had been depleted by decades of continuous warfare. The death of Cardinal Richelieu in 1642 and Louis XIII in 1643 removed key architects of French policy, while Ferdinand III proved more flexible than his predecessor in seeking diplomatic accommodation. The new generation of leaders who emerged during the 1640s had grown up during the war years and understood its costs in ways that earlier generations had not. They were more willing to accept compromise solutions that preserved essential interests while abandoning maximalist goals that had sustained the conflict through its earlier phases. Serious peace negotiations began in 1644, with the Westphalian towns of Munster and Osnabrück serving as venues for parallel discussions that addressed the complex web of competing claims and grievances that had accumulated over 3 decades of warfare. The French negotiated with the Emperor and Catholic princes at Munster, while Swedish representatives met with imperial delegations at Osnabrück. This arrangement allowed face-saving compromises while addressing practical problems of protocol and precedents that could have derailed negotiations before they began. The separation of venues also enabled parallel discussions of different aspects of the overall settlement, speeding the negotiation process while allowing specialized focus on particular issues. The diplomatic process proved almost as complex as the war itself, involving over 140 separate delegations that eventually participated in negotiations addressing not only German religious and constitutional issues, but also broader European territorial disputes. The talks resembled a European Congress more than simple peace negotiations, establishing precedents for later diplomatic gatherings. The sheer number of participants and issues involved required innovative diplomatic procedures that balanced the need for comprehensive discussion with practical requirements of timely decision. Negotiators developed new methods of consultation, communication, and coordination that would influence European diplomacy for generations. The Peace of Westphalia, signed on October 24, 1648, ended the German phases of the 30 Years' War through a series of interconnected agreements that reshaped the European political landscape in fundamental ways. The treaties recognized principles that would influence international relations for centuries, while addressing specific grievances that had fueled 3 decades of devastating conflict. Religious settlement formed a central component of the peace agreements, extending and refining the principles established at Augsburg nearly a century earlier. The principle of cuius regio, ius religio, was reaffirmed and extended to include Calvinism alongside Catholicism and Lutheranism as a recognized faith within the imperial system. The establishment of 1624 as the normal year for determining religious affiliations prevented further disputes over church property while ensuring that existing arrangements would be maintained regardless of future political changes. This provision protected both Catholic and Protestant interests while creating stability that had been absent since the early years of the Reformation. Constitutional changes within the Holy Roman Empire proved equally significant for the future development of German political culture. The peace treaties strengthened the authority of imperial estates while limiting the emperor's power to act unilaterally in religious matters, creating a more balanced system of governance that required consultation and consensus. The imperial diet gained enhanced importance as a forum for mediating disputes between emperor and princes, while the principle of imperial immediacy was clarified and protected against arbitrary imperial intervention. These constitutional provisions would influence German political development until the empire's final dissolution in 1806. Territorial adjustments reflected the military realities created by 30 years of warfare, while establishing new strategic balances that would shape European politics for generations. France acquired Alsace and strategic fortresses along the Rhine, establishing a permanent French presence in the heart of Europe that would influence Franco-German relations for centuries. Sweden gained western Pomerania and the bishoprics of Bremen and Verden, securing control over Baltic trade routes while establishing a Swedish presence in the Holy Roman Empire that would persist until the Napoleonic era. These acquisitions marked Sweden's emergence as a major European power and reflected the success of Gustavus Adolphus's original strategic vision. Brandenburg Prussia received eastern Pomerania and several strategic bishoprics, laying foundations for its later rise to great power status and eventual leadership of German unification efforts. These seemingly modest territorial gains provided the electoral house with resources and strategic position that would prove crucial during subsequent centuries. The human cost of the 30 Years' War exacted a price that shocked contemporaries and continues to horrify modern historians who study this period of European development. Population estimates suggest that the Holy Roman Empire lost between 4.5 and 8 million inhabitants during the conflict, with some regions experiencing population declines of over 50%. These demographic losses resulted not primarily from battlefield casualties, which were relatively modest by later standards, but from disease, famine, and displacement that affected civilian populations throughout the conflict zone. The breakdown of agricultural systems, the disruption of trade networks, and the collapse of public health measures created conditions that made survival increasingly difficult for ordinary people. Individual communities experienced devastation that defied contemporary understanding and created lasting trauma in collective memory. The town of Augsburg, which had boasted 48,000 residents in 1620, counted only 21,000 survivors in 1650. Munich's population fell from 22,000 to 17,000 during the same period, while countless smaller communities simply disappeared entirely. Rural areas suffered even more severely than urban centers, as the countryside bore the brunt of military operations while lacking the defensive walls and stored supplies that sometimes enabled cities to survive extended sieges. Entire villages vanished from maps as their inhabitants fled, died, or were conscripted into passing armies. Contemporary accounts describe a transformed landscape where normal social order had collapsed completely, and survival required adaptations that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Peasant revolts erupted across German territories as rural populations organized desperate resistance against rapacious soldiers from all armies. The proliferation of witch trials during the war years reflected widespread searching for supernatural explanations of unprecedented suffering and social breakdown. Communities that had coexisted peacefully for generations turned against alleged witches, heretics, and other supposed sources of divine displeasure in desperate attempts to restore cosmic order. Despite its devastating human cost, the 30 Years' War accelerated military and social developments that would shape European civilization for centuries to come. The tactical innovations pioneered by Gustavus Adolphus influenced military thinking well into the 18th century, while the logistical challenges of maintaining large armies over extended periods forced governments to develop more sophisticated administrative systems. The war demonstrated the decisive advantages of professional standing armies over traditional feudal levies or irregular mercenary bands. States that could maintain disciplined, well-supplied forces possessed overwhelming advantages over those relying on older military systems, driving military reforms throughout Europe during subsequent decades. Social changes proved equally profound, if less immediately visible to contemporary observers. The collapse of traditional authority structures created opportunities for social mobility, while destroying established communities and creating new forms of social organization based on military rather than civilian models. Religious certainties that had sustained European civilization for centuries gave way to skepticism and tolerance born of exhaustion with theological conflict. The educated classes began questioning whether religious differences justified massive human suffering, laying intellectual foundations for the religious tolerance and secular governance that would characterize later European development. The Peace of Westphalia established principles that would govern European international relations until the French Revolution and beyond, creating a diplomatic framework that balanced competing interests while preventing any single power from dominating the continent. The concept of sovereign equality among states, regardless of size or military power, emerged from negotiations designed to protect smaller territories from absorption by their more powerful neighbors. Religious tolerance, while far from complete, made significant advances through the Westphalian settlement that recognized multiple Christian denominations as legitimate and protected religious villages, minorities within territories ruled by princes of different faiths. The acceptance of Calvinism as a legitimate faith, along with provisions protecting religious minorities, marked important steps toward the religious pluralism that would characterize modern European society. The subordination of religious to political considerations in international affairs became a lasting feature of the European state system, establishing the principle that reasons of state should take precedence over confessional loyalties in diplomatic and military decisions. This transformation did not occur immediately or uniformly, but the Westphalian precedent established crucial foundations for later development. The Holy Roman Empire survived the conflict, but emerged fundamentally transformed in ways that would influence German political development for centuries. Imperial authority was limited and circumscribed, while the autonomy of territorial princes was enhanced and protected against arbitrary interference. This decentralization would persist until the empire's final dissolution in 1806, influencing the development of German political culture and complicating later attempts at national unification. The federal structure of modern Germany can trace its origins to the constitutional arrangements established at Westphalia. Economic consequences of the war extended far beyond immediate destruction and population loss to encompass permanent changes in European commercial and financial systems. Traditional trade routes were disrupted, leading to the permanent decline of some commercial centers, while others rose to prominence based on their ability to adapt to new conditions. The development of more sophisticated financial instruments and banking systems during the war years contributed to the commercial revolution that would transform European economy during subsequent centuries. The ability to finance large-scale military operations across international boundaries required innovations in credit, exchange, and investment that laid foundations for modern capitalism. Cultural developments reflected the war's profound psychological impact on European civilization in ways that influenced artistic, literary, and intellectual development for generations. The Baroque style, with its emphasis on drama, emotionally, intensity, and the fragility of human existence, captured the spiritual crisis created by decades of religious warfare. Literature began exploring themes of uncertainty, mortality, and the breakdown of traditional order in ways that departed radically from the confident humanism of the Renaissance era. Works like Grimmelshausen's Simplicissimus provided realistic portrayals of wartime experience that influenced European literature for centuries. The 30 Years' War marked the effective end of religious warfare as a major feature of European politics, establishing the principle that theological disputes should not serve as primary justification for major military conflicts. While religious differences continued to influence international relations, rarely again would confessional loyalties override state interests in determining policy. This transformation represented one of the most significant developments in European political culture, establishing foundations for the secular international system that would characterize modern European diplomacy. The exhaustion and devastation produced by 3 decades of religious warfare convinced political leaders that some prices were too high to pay, even for religious truth. The development of religious tolerance proceeded gradually and imperfectly, but the Westphalian precedent established important principles that would influence later development. The idea that different Christian denominations could coexist within the same political system, while radical for its time, pointed toward more comprehensive religious freedom in subsequent centuries. As we drift toward peaceful slumber, we can reflect on how the 30 Years' War transformed European civilization in ways that contemporaries could never have anticipated or imagined. What began as a religious rebellion in distant Bohemia evolved into a continental struggle that reshaped political boundaries, religious practices, international law, and the fundamental assumptions underlying European political culture. The conflict demonstrated both the destructive potential of religious fanaticism and ideological extremism, and the remarkable resilience of European civilization in recovering from even the most devastating catastrophe. The Peace of Westphalia represented not merely an end to warfare, but a new beginning for European political development based on principles of balance, tolerance, and pragmatic accommodation. The Habsburg dream of universal monarchy died forever in the ashes and ruins of the 30 Years' War, replaced by a balance of power system that would characterize European politics for centuries, while preventing any single dynasty or nation from dominating the continent. France emerged as the dominant continental power, while the Holy Roman Empire became a confederation of semi-independent states under Habsburg leadership. Perhaps most importantly, the war taught European leaders that some prices were too high to pay, even for the most deeply held religious convictions or political ambitions. The memory of devastated landscapes and decimated populations would influence European statecraft long after the last Swedish garrison departed Germany and the final Spanish fortress surrendered to French forces. The 30 Years' War stands as a monument to both human folly and human resilience, a reminder that even the deepest religious and political divisions can be overcome through patient negotiation and mutual compromise. The principles of tolerance, sovereignty, and peaceful coexistence that emerged from this terrible conflict continue to shape our world today, offering hope that humanity can learn from its darkest experiences. As you close your eyes tonight, dear listener, remember that from the ashes of Europe's greatest religious conflict arose institutions and ideas that made possible centuries of generally peaceful development. The villages that slowly rebuilt themselves in the gentle years following 1648 stand as symbols of humanity's ability to heal, recover, and create new forms of civilization from the ruins of the old. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be as peaceful as those communities that learned to live together despite their differences, finding in mutual tolerance and respect the foundations for a more peaceful world.